The city lights flickered against the darkening sky as Police Chief Thomas made his way to his car in the headquarters parking lot. It had been another long day at the office, the kind where coffee had become more of a companion than a beverage. His shoulders felt heavy, not just from the weight of his jacket, but from the hours he'd spent reviewing department policies on racial profiling and community engagement. As he slid into his personal car, a modest blue sedan that blended perfectly with every other vehicle on the road, he couldn't help but smile at the family photo stuck to his dashboard. It showed him with his wife and kids at last summer's barbecue, all wearing matching goofy aprons his daughter had picked out. The sight of it always reminded him of why he took this job in the first place, to make their city a better place, not just for his family, but for everyone's family. The engine hummed to life, and Thomas adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his tired face. 20 years in law enforcement had left their mark, a few gray hairs at his temples and smile lines around his eyes. He remembered his first day as a rookie officer, how proud he'd felt putting on the uniform, and how that pride had only grown when he became the city's first black police chief 3 years ago. The streets were quieter now, with only a few cars making their way home. Thomas took the familiar route, his mind wandering to the meeting he had earlier that day. The community outreach program was showing promising results, but there was still so much work to be done. He'd spent hours going through complaint reports, each one a reminder of the trust gap they needed to bridge between the police and the community. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, "Don't forget to pick up milk." He smiled, remembering their morning conversation about the empty fridge. It was these little, normal moments that kept him grounded, reminded him that behind every badge and title, they were all just people trying to make it through their day. As he drove past the local park, now empty except for a few evening joggers, Thomas reflected on his journey. From being a kid who used to play in these same streets to now being responsible for keeping them safe, life had come full circle. He remembered the challenges he'd faced, the obstacles he'd overcome, and the mentors who'd believed in him when others didn't. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul music that reminded him of Sunday afternoons at his grandmother's house. She'd always told him, "Baby, you've got to be twice as good to get half as far." Those words had stuck with him, pushing him to excel at the academy, to earn every promotion, to prove himself not just as a black officer, but as someone who could lead and make a difference. Traffic lights cast red and green glows across his dashboard as he made his way through the suburban streets. He noticed how some people would lock their car doors when they saw him approach at traffic lights. An old habit he'd experienced countless times, both in and out of uniform. These small moments were why he'd pushed so hard for better training in the department, why he believed that change had to start from within. The evening air was cool when he rolled down his window at a stop sign, letting the breeze carry away some of the day's tension. He was looking forward to getting home, maybe catching the end of the game on TV, helping his kids with their homework if they were still up. Just another evening in the life of a police chief who happened to be black, trying to balance the weight of his badge with the reality of his skin color. Little did he know, his ordinary drive home was about to become anything but ordinary. As he checked his mirrors and signaled for a turn, he couldn't have predicted how the next few minutes would not only change his life, but would become a powerful lesson for his entire department. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror caught Chief Thomas by surprise. He'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, had used his turn signals properly, and his car was in perfect condition. He'd just had it serviced last week. Years of experience, both as a police officer and as a black man, made his heart sink. He knew this feeling all too well. Following standard procedure, the same one he'd taught countless times at the academy, Thomas carefully pulled over to the right side of the quiet suburban street. His hands moved to the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, clearly visible. The interior light was already on, a habit he'd developed long before he ever thought about becoming a police officer. Through his side mirror, he watched the patrol car door open. The officer stepped out slowly, one hand already resting on his holster. An unnecessary gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Thomas. He recognized the stance, the slightly aggressive posture. In his 20 years on the force, he'd seen it too many times, usually directed at people who looked just like him. "Keep calm," Thomas whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the idle of his engine. He could feel his pulse quickening, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar frustration. Here he was, the chief of police, about to experience what so many in his community had complained about during town halls and community meetings. The beam of a flashlight swept through his car, lingering a bit too long on his face. Officer Parker. Thomas could now read the nameplate, approached with heavy steps, deliberately scuffing his boots on the pavement. It was an old intimidation tactic, one that Thomas had specifically addressed in recent training sessions. License and registration, Parker demanded, skipping any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp, unnecessarily aggressive. The flashlight beam remained fixed on Thomas's face, despite the well-lit street and the car's interior light. Thomas kept his movements slow and deliberate. "Good evening, officer," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the situation. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" It was a reasonable question, one that any citizen had the right to ask. "I said, license and registration," Parker repeated, his voice taking on an edge that Thomas knew wasn't warranted. The officer's free hand had moved back to his holster. Another unnecessary gesture that spoke volumes about his assumptions. Thomas could feel his neck muscles tightening. He'd been on both sides of this scenario, as the officer and as the civilian, but tonight he was choosing to be neither. He was going to be the teacher. "Officer Parker," he said evenly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I have the right to know why I've been stopped." The flashlight beam wavered slightly, the first sign that Parker was thrown off script. Most people he stopped probably didn't know proper procedure well enough to challenge him. "You were driving suspiciously," Parker said, the words coming out like they'd been rehearsed. "Suspiciously?" Thomas repeated, keeping his tone professional. "Could you please define what you mean by suspicious driving?" He knew there had been no traffic violations. His decades of experience had made proper driving as natural as breathing. The tension in the air grew thicker. Other cars passed by slowly, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene. Thomas wondered what they saw, just another traffic stop. Or did they recognize the subtle dance of power and prejudice playing out under these street lights? Parker shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with being questioned. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice trying to mask uncertainty with authority. It was the kind of command that could escalate a situation unnecessarily, exactly what Thomas had been working to change in his department. This moment, Thomas realized, was about to become more than just another traffic stop. It was about to become a lesson, one that Officer Parker would never forget. But first, he had to handle the next few seconds perfectly. Everything he taught, everything he believed in about reform and justice, was about to be put to the test. The street lamps cast long shadows as Chief Thomas carefully opened his car door. Every movement was measured, deliberate, the kind of careful choreography that shouldn't be necessary but had become second nature over the years. The cool night air carried the distant sound of crickets, a peaceful backdrop to this tense moment. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Parker barked, taking a step back. His flashlight beam never wavered from Thomas's face, creating harsh shadows that made the scene feel more dramatic than it needed to be. A few cars drove by slowly, their passengers watching the scene unfold like a live theater performance. Thomas stood straight, his posture relaxed but dignified. At 6 feet tall, he normally had a commanding presence, but tonight he carefully made himself appear less imposing. "Officer Parker," he said calmly, "I want you to take a moment and think about why you really pulled me over tonight." Parker's response came quick and rehearsed. "Sir, I don't have to explain myself to you. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." The words tumbled out with practiced authority, but there was an undertone of something else, perhaps uncertainty, or maybe just poor training. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a car door slammed. Thomas remained still, his hands visible but not raised. "Actually, you do need to explain," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in law enforcement. "Every traffic stop requires probable cause. That's not just department policy, it's the law." The flashlight beam flickered slightly as Parker's hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "You matched a description," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Thomas felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same one he'd carried since his academy days. And what description would that be? Officer Parker? The question hung in the air like morning fog, heavy with unspoken implications. Parker shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the asphalt. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet street. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to." "You'll have to what?" Thomas interrupted, not unkindly. "Call for backup. Run my license plate. Or maybe you'd like to check my ID." He reached slowly toward his back pocket, noting how Parker's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. "Before you make that next move, I want you to really think about why your hand keeps going to your gun when I haven't shown any sign of aggression." The air between them grew thick with tension. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the sweet scent of someone's late-night barbecue, a normal evening for everyone else on this street, while this moment of reckoning played out under the streetlights. "My ID is in my wallet," Thomas continued, his voice steady and clear. "Along with my badge. The same badge you wear, Officer Parker. The same badge I've worn for 20 years. The same badge I now oversee as your chief of police." The flashlight beam dropped suddenly, like a spotlight going dark in a theater. Parker's face, now visible in the street light, showed a rapid succession of emotions: disbelief, shock, and then something that looked very much like shame. "Chief, Parker's voice cracked, all pretense of authority evaporating like morning dew. The hand that had been hovering near his weapon fell limply to his side. "Don't apologize yet," Thomas said, finally pulling out his wallet. "First, I want you to understand something. Tonight, you didn't stop the police chief. You stopped a black man in a nice car in a quiet neighborhood. The only difference is, this time, that black man happens to be your boss." A car passed by, its headlights illuminating both men's faces for a brief moment, one standing tall with quiet dignity, the other suddenly looking very young and very lost. The scene could have turned ugly, could have become another statistic, another headline. Instead, it was about to become something else entirely. A teaching moment that would change not just Officer Parker, but an entire department. Officer Parker stared at the police chief's badge like it was something from another world. His flashlight, now pointed at the ground, created a small pool of light between them. The night seemed to hold its breath as the reality of the situation sank in. I didn't know," Parker stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The confident swagger from earlier had vanished, replaced by something that looked very much like a rookie's first day on the job. His hand, which had been so quick to rest on his weapon earlier, now hung limply at his side. Chief Thomas tucked his badge back into his wallet with deliberate slowness. "That's exactly the point," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't know who I was, but you thought you knew everything about me the moment you saw me through your windshield." A couple walked their dog on the opposite sidewalk, their quiet conversation drifting across the street. They slowed down to watch the scene, probably wondering what story was unfolding between these two men standing in the pool of streetlight. "Get in your car, Officer Parker," Thomas said, gesturing to the patrol vehicle. Parker's confusion was evident, his feet shuffling uncertainly on the asphalt. "Not to leave," Thomas clarified. "We're going to have a conversation that's long overdue." The interior of the patrol car felt smaller than usual as both men sat in the front seats. The radio crackled softly with routine dispatches, a reminder that the rest of the world was carrying on as normal while this moment of truth played out in a parked police cruiser. "How long have you been on the force?" Thomas asked, settling into the passenger seat. The familiar smell of coffee and leather brought back memories of his own patrol days. 3 years, sir," Parker replied, his eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to meet his chief's gaze. His hands rested in his lap, fingers interlocking and unlocking in a nervous dance. 3 years, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me something, in those 3 years, how many times have you pulled over a car just because something felt suspicious about the driver?" The question hung in the air like morning fog. Parker's silence was answer enough. The soft blue glow from the dashboard computer cast shadows across his face, highlighting the internal struggle playing out in his expression. "I'm going to tell you a story," Thomas continued, shifting slightly to face Parker. "It happened 20 years ago, before I joined the force. I was driving my daughter to the hospital. She had a fever that wouldn't break. Got pulled over 3 times that night. 3 different officers, 3 different excuses, same real reason. The radio chatter filled the silence between them. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, other officers responding to other calls, unaware that one of the most important police interactions of the night was happening in a quiet conversation. Each time, Thomas went on, his voice steady, I had to swallow my fear and anger. Had to stay calm while my baby girl was burning up in the back seat. Had to say yes, sir, and no, sir, while precious minutes ticked by. That night changed me. Made me want to be part of the solution. Parker finally turned to look at his chief, really look at him, maybe for the first time. The streetlight caught the moisture in his eyes. I never, he started, then stopped, searching for words. I didn't think. That's right, Thomas said gently. You didn't think. But now you're going to start. Tonight wasn't just about you pulling over the wrong person. It was about pulling over anyone for the wrong reasons. The weight of understanding seemed to physically press Parker back in his seat. The badge on his chest, which had felt like a shield of authority just minutes ago, now felt heavy with responsibility. Tomorrow, Thomas said, reaching for the door handle, you're going to come to my office first thing. We're going to review every traffic stop you've made in the last 3 months. Every single one. And then we're going to talk about what real police work looks like. The night air rushed in as Thomas opened the door, carrying with it the sounds of the city they both served. He paused before stepping out, looking back at the officer who was still processing everything that had happened. This can be the worst night of your career, Thomas said, or it can be the night that made you a better officer. The choice is yours. The next morning arrived with the soft golden light of dawn streaming through the police headquarters windows. Chief Thomas sat at his desk, a stack of files in front of him, every traffic stop Officer Parker had made in the past 3 months. The coffee in his mug was still steaming when a gentle knock came at the door. Parker stood in the doorway, looking like he hadn't slept much. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes carried the weight of a night spent in deep thought. Chief, he said quietly, reporting as ordered. Come in, Thomas replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. There's fresh coffee in the pot if you need it. The offer was simple but meaningful, a reminder that this meeting wasn't about punishment, but understanding. As Parker poured himself a cup, his hands trembled slightly. The morning sunlight caught the steam rising from the coffee, creating dancing shadows on the wall. He sat down carefully, as if the chair might break under the weight of his conscience. Before we look at these files, Thomas began, tapping the stack of papers, I want you to tell me about your first day on the force. Why did you become a police officer? The question seemed to catch Parker off guard. He stared into his coffee cup as if the answer might be floating there. I wanted to help people, he said finally. My grandfather was a cop. He used to tell me stories about making a difference in people's lives. Thomas nodded, letting the silence encourage Parker to continue. Outside the office window, the city was waking up, people heading to work, kids walking to school, life moving forward as it always did. He was my hero, Parker continued, his voice growing stronger. He taught me that being a police officer was about protecting everyone, serving the community. He paused, the irony of his recent actions hitting him hard. I guess somewhere along the way, I forgot that part. Tell me about last night, Thomas said, pushing the files aside for the moment. What was going through your mind when you first saw my car? Parker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He stopped, struggling with the truth. I made assumptions. I saw a nice car in a quiet neighborhood, and instead of seeing a citizen, I saw a suspect. I didn't even have a real reason. And that's exactly why we're here, Thomas said, leaning forward. Every person we stop is someone's father, mother, son, daughter. Every interaction we have can either build trust or break it. Last night, you weren't protecting anyone, you were acting on prejudice. The words hung in the air between them. Through the office walls came the muffled sounds of the department coming to life. Phones ringing, officers checking in, the daily rhythm of law enforcement continuing around them. I want to show you something, Thomas said, standing up and walking to a photo on his wall. It showed a group of officers from 20 years ago. See that young officer in the back? That's me, fresh out of the academy. And see the white officer standing next to me? He pulled me over 3 times in my first month here, before he knew I was a fellow officer. Parker looked at the photo, really looked at it. What happened? He became one of my best mentors, Thomas replied, a small smile playing at his lips. Because someone took the time to show him his blind spots, just like I'm doing with you now. He learned, he changed, and he made sure others learned too. Walking back to his desk, Thomas opened one of the files. Now let's look at these traffic stops together. But I want you to look at them through new eyes. For each one, I want you to tell me what you see now that you didn't see then. The morning light grew stronger as they went through the files, one by one. With each review, Parker's understanding seemed to deepen. They talked about alternative approaches, about community impact, about the difference between real policing and acting on prejudice. You know what the hardest part of being a good cop is? Thomas asked, closing the last file. It's not catching the bad guys or solving crimes. It's facing our own biases, admitting when we're wrong, and doing the hard work to be better. Parker nodded, his face showing the first signs of real understanding. I want to learn, he said quietly but firmly. I want to be better. That's why we're here, Thomas replied, standing up. Because change doesn't happen in big moments, it happens in small decisions every day. Starting today, you're going to ride with Officer Chen. She's one of our best community officers. Watch how she interacts with people, learn from her approach. As Parker stood to leave, Thomas added one final thought. This isn't just about you anymore. Every officer you work with, every rookie you train in the future, they'll learn from your example. The question is, what example will you set? The weeks following that night brought winds of change through the police department. Chief Thomas stood at the front of the packed training room, looking out at the sea of uniforms before him. The usual chatter and coffee cup shuffling had been replaced by attentive silence as he shared the story of his traffic stop with Officer Parker. What happened that night wasn't unique, Thomas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. What makes it different is what we choose to do about it. He clicked to the next slide, showing traffic stop statistics from the past year. The numbers told their own story, one that made several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. In the back of the room, Officer Parker sat straight-backed, his expression thoughtful. The past few weeks riding with Officer Chen had opened his eyes to a different way of policing. He'd watched her diffuse tense situations with a few kind words, seen her earn trust in neighborhoods where trust in law enforcement was scarce. Starting today, Thomas continued, we're implementing new training protocols. He gestured to a stack of manuals on the table beside him. But these aren't just words on paper. This is about changing how we think, how we act, and most importantly, how we serve our community. The training room's old ceiling fans whirred softly overhead as Thomas clicked through examples of good and bad traffic stops. Body camera footage played on the screen, sparking discussions about alternative approaches and better techniques. Officers who'd been on the force for decades found themselves questioning practices they'd taken for granted. During the lunch break, small groups gathered in the department cafeteria, the usual talk about sports and weekend plans replaced by serious discussions about community policing. At one table, Officer Chen shared stories from her years of building relationships in the neighborhoods she patrolled. Remember last week? She asked Parker, who sat across from her. That teenager who usually runs from cops. He came up to us just to talk. That's what happens when you build trust instead of fear. Back in the training room, Thomas introduced a new community feedback system. Every interaction matters, he explained, pulling up the digital interface on the screen. Citizens can now rate their interactions with officers, good or bad. This isn't about punishment, it's about learning and improving. Some officers grumbled about extra paperwork and longer procedures, but others saw the bigger picture. A veteran officer raised his hand. 20 years ago, he said, his voice carrying years of experience, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Maybe it's time we did. The afternoon session focused on practical exercises. Officers paired up, role-playing different scenarios. They switched roles, civilian and officer, getting a taste of both perspectives. The exercise hit home for many when they found themselves on the receiving end of biased treatment. Parker volunteered to share his experience, standing before his colleagues with a courage few had seen in him before. I thought I was doing my job, he said, his voice steady. But I was just using the badge as an excuse for prejudice. Working with Officer Chen showed me what real police work looks like. As the day wound down, Thomas gathered everyone for a final word. The setting sun through the windows painted the room in warm colors, a fitting backdrop for a day of enlightenment. Change isn't comfortable, he said, looking at each face in the room. But comfort isn't what we signed up for. We signed up to protect and serve all citizens, not just some. The changes weren't limited to training sessions. New protocols required officers to state the reason for traffic stops immediately. Body cameras had to be activated before leaving the patrol car. Monthly community meetings became mandatory, giving citizens a direct line to the officers serving their neighborhoods. In the parking lot after the session, Parker caught up with Thomas. "Chief," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said about setting an example." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to help train the new officers, share my story, make sure they don't make the same mistakes." Thomas smiled, remembering his own journey years ago. "That's how real change happens," he said. "One officer at a time, one lesson at a time." He looked out at the city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "We've got a long way to go, but this is a good start." As officers headed home that evening, something had shifted in the department's atmosphere. It wasn't just about new rules or procedures, it was about seeing their role in the community through fresh eyes. The incident that could have been just another statistic had become a catalyst for real change. 1 year had passed since that fateful night. The autumn leaves danced across the parking lot of the police academy as a new batch of recruits filed into the lecture hall. At the front of the room stood Officer Parker, no longer the uncertain cop from a year ago, but a changed man with an important story to share. "I want to tell you about the night that changed not just my career, but my entire perspective on what it means to wear this badge," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him as he shared his story of stopping the police chief. In the back of the room, Chief Thomas leaned against the wall, watching quietly. He couldn't help but smile at how far things had come. The department's latest statistics were displayed on a screen behind Parker. Traffic stops down by 40%, civilian complaints reduced by half, and community satisfaction ratings at an all-time high. "Being a good police officer isn't about how many tickets you write or arrests you make," Parker continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "It's about serving everyone in our community with respect and dignity. I learned that lesson the hard way." A young recruit raised her hand. "But how do you know when your instincts are right or when they're just prejudice?" The question hung in the air, honest and raw. Parker nodded, appreciating the directness. "That's exactly what we're here to talk about," he said, clicking to a new slide. "Let me show you some real situations we've faced and how our new approach made all the difference." The presentation showed body camera footage from recent months, officers handling tense situations with patience and respect, community meetings where citizens and police worked together to solve neighborhood problems, success stories that never made the headlines but made all the difference in people's lives. During the break, Chief Thomas watched as Parker chatted with the recruits, answering their questions with the kind of honesty that only comes from personal experience. In the hallway, photos from recent community events showed officers playing basketball with local kids, helping seniors with groceries, and attending neighborhood block parties. "Remember that teenager who used to run from us?" Officer Chen said, walking up beside Thomas. "He just applied to the academy. Says he wants to be part of the change." She smiled, remembering how things used to be. Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest ripples. Back in the lecture hall, Parker wrapped up his session with a challenge to the recruits. "Each of you will face moments that test your character," he said, his voice firm but encouraging. "Moments where you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. Remember, every person you interact with is someone's family member, someone's loved one." After the session, in the academy's small break room, a group of recruits gathered around Parker, eager to learn more. One of them, a young man with bright eyes, asked, "Did you ever think about quitting after that night?" Parker considered the question carefully. "Actually, that night made me want to be a better officer more than ever," he replied. "Because I realized this job isn't about power, it's about responsibility. Every badge comes with the power to either build trust or break it." Later that afternoon, Chief Thomas sat in his office, reviewing the latest community feedback reports. His desk now held photos from recent department events. Picnics where officers and citizens shared meals together, workshops where they learned from each other, moments that showed how far they'd come. A knock at his door revealed Parker, ready for their monthly check-in. These meetings had become a tradition, a way to ensure they never lost sight of the lessons learned that night. "You know what's different now?" Parker said, taking his usual seat. "When I'm patrol, I don't just see suspicious or not suspicious anymore. I see people, parents heading home from work, kids walking to school, families living their lives. And they see us differently too." Thomas nodded, remembering his own journey. "Change happens one interaction at a time," he said, looking out his window at the city they served. "Every traffic stop, every conversation, every moment is a chance to build trust or break it." As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the academy grounds, a new group of recruits headed home, carrying with them not just knowledge of procedures and protocols, but a deeper understanding of what it truly means to protect and serve. The story of that night had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had become a blueprint for change, a reminder that sometimes the biggest lessons come from our biggest mistakes. And somewhere in the city, a driver pulled over for a routine traffic stop would experience something different. An officer approaching with respect rather than suspicion, explaining the reason for the stop, treating them like a citizen rather than a suspect. Small changes, rippling outward, creating waves of transformation in the community they all called home.